It all ended with a single keystroke. But for Kalen Michaels, it started with one too. Picture this, a teenager's bedroom, long after midnight. The only light comes from a laptop screen, painting a pale, bluish glow across a face that's too young for the intensity etched into it. This is Kalen. And right now, his finger is hovering over the Enter key. This isn't for a school project or a video game. This is the final command. The one that would steal $50,000 from a man who wouldn't even miss it. Well, that's what Kalen told himself, anyway. You could hear a pin drop in that room. The only sound was the low hum of the computer's fan and the frantic beat of his own heart, thumping in his ears like a drum. He'd planned this for months. He'd built a labyrinth of digital false trails, encrypted layers, and proxy servers that bounced his signal from here to Tokyo and back. He was a ghost. A wisp of data in the vast, dark web. Untraceable. He took a sharp breath, and he pressed it. Click. On the screen, a cascade of code flashed by, a waterfall of green text on a black background. And then, it stopped. A single, blinking cursor. And one final line. Transfer, complete. $50,000. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Kalen's face. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He leaned back in his creaky desk chair, the tension draining from his shoulders, and he let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. In that moment, he wasn't just a 17-year-old kid from a dead-end town. He was a king. He was invincible. His eyes flickered away from the screen, over to the one thing in the room that kept his conscience quiet. A framed photograph on his desk, worn at the edges. It was his aunt, Carla, asleep in her armchair. She looked exhausted, even in sleep. And right next to her, on the little side table, was an empty prescription medicine bottle. That bottle was the reason for all of this. That bottle, and the slumlord who kept her security deposit, money she needed for her heart medication, because of a fictional stain on the carpet. This wasn't theft, he told himself. This was justice. He was Robin Hood in a hoodie. With a new, cold determination, he got to work cleaning up. He opened another program and began systematically wiping his digital footprints. He shredded temporary files, formatted hidden partitions, and scat a few more digital red herrings for any hypothetical investigator to find. He was meticulous. He was brilliant. He was sure, a genius. He finally shut the laptop closed. The room plunged into near darkness, the only light now the faint orange glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. It was over. He was safe. But then, a thing about computers. And about arrogance. They always leave a trace. Just as the screen went black, a small, silent notification had popped up in the corner of his screen. A system log. A diagnostic report he'd programmed himself to monitor for intruders. He'd been so focused on his own escape, he'd missed it. The log entry was simple, technical. But in plain English, it meant this. For exactly 37 seconds during his operation, an external, encrypted connection had been active on his machine. An IP address he didn't recognize had been silently listening in. Kalen saw it for a split second before the screen died. His brain registered it, filed it away under probably nothing. A glitch. A random network ping. The digital equivalent of a floorboard creaking in an old house. You hear it, but you don't really listen. He stood up, stretched, and walked to his window, looking out at the sleeping town of Cedar Falls. He felt a power surge through him. He had outsmarted the system. He had won. He had no idea that the system had already begun to fight back. Now, let's rewind the clock just a little. To the morning after Kalen's perfect crime. Across town, in an office that smelled of stale coffee and old paper, a man named Silas Vance was having a very, very bad day. He wasn't a nice man. He owned half the rundown buildings in Cedar Falls, including the one Kalen and his aunt lived in. He was used to being the one who squeezed people, not the one getting squeezed. So when he saw that $50,000 had vanished from a very specific, very secret offshore account, he didn't panic. He got cold. Calculating. He couldn't exactly run to the police and shout, "Officer, someone stole my illegally hidden money." But he also couldn't let this slide. It was a sign of disrespect. A crack in his armor. So he made a call. He reported a cyber intrusion. A limited, contained hack. He gave just enough information to be taken seriously, but not enough to expose his own dirty laundry. He made it sound like a sophisticated attempt to sabotage his legitimate business. And that's how the case landed on the desk of Detective Eva Rostova. If Kalin was a ghost in the machine, Detective Rostova was the machine's mechanic. She was a transplant from the cybercrimes unit in Cleveland, a woman who had seen it all. She didn't wear a trench coat. She wore a practical blazer and had a look in her eyes that could dissect a lie from a mile away. She listened to Vance's carefully edited story, her face a mask of professional neutrality. But inside, her instincts were buzzing. This wasn't some random spam attack. The report she read, it showed a level of skill that was rare. Elegant, even. It was the work of someone who wasn't just mashing keys, they were conducting a digital symphony. But as she looked over the initial data logs, she saw something else, too. Something Kalin, in all his brilliance, would never have considered. Arrogance. The hack was too clean, too flawless. It had a signature. The kind of signature left by someone who wants to prove how smart they are. Someone who studies. She leaned back in her chair, looking at the maze of code on her screen. She wasn't looking for a person yet. She was looking for a pattern. A mind. She picked up the phone and called her captain. Her voice was calm, but absolute. This wasn't a kid playing games, she said. This was someone who read the manual. Someone who prepared. She paused, and you could almost hear the faint click of a mental trap being set. And everyone who studies, she said, a quiet certainty in her voice, leaves a trail of notes. I'm going to find them. For the next 2 weeks, life in Cedar Falls went on like normal. The sun rose and set. The Rust Belt wind whistled through the streets. And Kalin Michaels walked around with a secret that made him feel 10 feet tall. He was careful, at first. The money was a sleeping dragon, and he wasn't about to poke it. He let it sit, digital and quiet, in its maze of accounts. But life has a way of forcing your hand. His Aunt Carla came home from her shift at the diner one night, her face pale with pain. She tried to hide it, but he saw the way she winced when she sat down, her hand drifting to her chest. The old prescription had run out, and the new one was sitting at the pharmacy, waiting for money they didn't have. That was the moment theory became practice. Kalin couldn't wait any longer. The next day, he went to an ATM 2 towns over. He withdrew a few $100s in crisp, new bills. When he handed that cash to his aunt, telling her a story about a freelance coding gig he'd landed online, the look on her face was worth every risk. It wasn't just relief. It was pure, unadulterated pride. She pulled him into a tight hug, her voice thick with emotion. "My brilliant boy," she'd whispered. And in that moment, Kalin's belief that he was a hero solidified into concrete. He wasn't a criminal. He was a provider. But that confidence, that was the first crack. The first breadcrumb. Because to pull off that cash withdrawal, he'd had to make the digital money physical. That meant using a small portion of the funds to order something online. A specific, high-end, encrypted router he could use to create an even more secure connection for future withdrawals. He was building a fortress, but to do it, he had to open a tiny, almost invisible door. He had it shipped to a P.O. box he'd rented under a fake name. Smart, right? Seemed like it. But what he didn't consider was the digital footprint of the purchase itself. The shipping company's database logged the location of that P.O. box. And that location was in a cluster of data points, a geographic area that included his neighborhood, his street, his home. Meanwhile, back in her office, Detective Rostova was hitting wall after wall. The digital trail was a masterwork of misdirection. Every time she thought she had a lock on the hacker's location, the path led to a dead end in another country. It was frustrating. But she was a patient hunter. She knew that when a smart person feels safe, they get comfortable. And comfortable people make mistakes. She decided to stop chasing the ghost and start profiling the person. She thought, who would want to target Silas Vance? And who has the skill to do it? She ran through his known associates, mostly thugs and low-level enforcers. None of them could code their way out of a paper bag. So, she shifted her focus. If it wasn't a personal grudge from Vance's world, it was a moral one. Someone with a bone to pick, and the brains to pick it. She started looking at complaints filed against Vance's properties, tenant disputes, code violations. And then she expanded her search to a pool of potential talent. She pulled records of high-level coding books checked out from the Cedar Falls Public Library. She looked at login times for public computers accessing deep web forums or legal research sites. It was a long shot. A needle in a haystack. But then her computer chimed. A cross-reference hit. Two things had just connected in the system. A cluster of shipping data for a highly specific piece of networking hardware a sophisticated hacker might use, was registered to a P.O. box. And that P.O. box's geographic location was a 5-minute walk from the Cedar Falls Public Library. And the library's digital record showed that one particular user, registered under the name Kalen Michaels, had spent over 47 hours in the last 3 months logged into their computers, primarily accessing two things: advanced coding tutorials and state legal databases. Rostova leaned closer to her screen, a slow, focused smile touching her lips. The ghost wasn't a ghost anymore. It had a name. The trail of breadcrumbs had begun. And at the other end, Kalen was still blissfully unaware, convinced he was too smart to ever be found. The investigation was no longer just lines of code on a screen. For Detective Rostova, it was now about the smell of old books and the feel of worn-out carpet. She decided to pay a visit to the Cedar Falls Public Library. She didn't go in with a badge flashing. She went in as a civilian, wearing a simple jacket and a friendly smile. She found the head librarian, a kind-faced woman named Marjorie who had seen generations of kids come and go. Rostova struck up a casual conversation, saying she was new in town and impressed by the library's resources. Then, she gently steered the talk toward the computers. "I'm in IT myself," she said, which wasn't exactly a lie. "Do you get a lot of serious users on them? Programmers, students?" Marjorie's face lit up. "Oh, we have one or two. There's one boy, Kalen Michaels. Bright as a button. So quiet. He's here almost every day after school." She leaned in conspiratorially. "He's not on those video games, either. Always in the legal databases or those complicated coding sites. I always thought he'd be a lawyer one day. He has the mind for it." Bingo. Rostova kept her smile easy, but inside, everything was clicking into place. Kalen Michaels. The name from the records. The quiet, brilliant boy with a fascination for the law. It fit the profile perfectly. Meanwhile, Kalen was about to make his second, and far more dangerous, mistake. Overconfidence. He was at the library, of course. Buried in a law textbook, when he saw her. He didn't know she was a detective, but he recognized a stranger, and strangers in his small, predictable world stood out. She had a focused intensity about her that made the back of his neck prickle. His hacker's instinct, the one that had saved him before, screamed one word: danger. But his ego, that newly swollen part of him, whispered something else. This is a test. Show her you're smarter. So, instead of packing up and leaving, he did something incredibly stupid. He walked right up to her as she was browsing the fiction section. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice calm, friendly. "You look a little lost." Detective Rostova turned, and for a split second, she was genuinely surprised. This was him. The boy from the records, standing right in front of her. He was brave. Or foolish. She recovered instantly, giving him a warm smile. "Oh, just getting a feel for the town. It's so quiet compared to the city." They made small talk. Kalen, playing the part of the helpful local, mentioned a recent spate of car break-ins a few streets over. He was smooth. He was charming. But then he said, "You know, most of those crimes are crimes of opportunity. But the sophisticated ones, the ones that really interest me, those are usually about justice. Don't you think?" He was looking right at her, a faint, knowing glint in his eye. He was baiting her. He was telling her, without telling her, that he knew exactly what kind of crime this was. Rostova played along perfectly. "Is that so?" she said, her tone light. "You seem to know a lot about it." "Oh, I just read a lot," Kalen said with a shrug, his performance flawless. "It's fascinating what people can get away with, if they're smart enough." He walked away then, feeling a thrill of victory. He had looked the enemy in the eye and hadn't flinched. He thought he had proven his dominance. What he didn't see was the look on Rostova's face as he turned his back. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was confirmation. His little speech about sophisticated crimes and justice hadn't just been a performance. It was a confession. He had just perfectly matched the psychological profile she'd built in her mind. The arrogant, morally righteous hacker. She left the library and got back into her car. She picked up her phone and called the station. "I need a warrant for CCTV footage around a specific P.O. box location," she said, her voice all business now. "And I need a background check on a Kalen Michaels, resident of 1428 Hemlock Street." The net, once a wide, invisible web in the digital sky, was now made of physical things, of street cameras and public records. And it was slowly, surely, beginning to tighten around the boy who thought he was a ghost. Back in his bedroom fortress, Kalen was flying high. The encounter with the woman at the library hadn't scared him. It had addicted him to the thrill. He felt like he was in a movie, and he was the brilliant anti-hero, always 2 steps ahead of the clueless authorities. This was the most dangerous place for a criminal to be, inside his own head, believing his own press. He sat at his laptop, a smirk playing on his lips. He'd taken care of his aunt. He'd stared down what he assumed was some kind of investigator. He was untouchable. So, he decided to have a little fun. To salt the wound. He opened a new, encrypted anonymous email account. The recipient, Silas Vance. The subject line was left blank. In the body of the email, he wrote just one line, a quote from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. "Oh, it is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant." He hit send. It was a perfect, poetic taunt. It spoke of justice and the abuse of power. It was exactly the kind of thing a morally superior intellectual would send. He leaned back, imagining Vance's confused, furious face. This wasn't just a crime anymore. It was a performance. And Kalen was giving an encore. What he didn't know, what his arrogance blinded him to, was that Detective Rostova, anticipating exactly this kind of move, had secured a wiretap on Vance's email. She wasn't just waiting for him to slip up, she was waiting for him to boast. The moment that email landed in Vance's inbox, an alert flashed on Rostova's screen. She read the quote. It was specific, obscure. It wasn't something you'd find in a generic online search for justice quotes. This was from someone who knew literature. Someone who wanted to show off their education. And that's when she remembered Marjorie the librarian saying, "I always thought he'd be a lawyer one day." She called the high school. Posing as a potential scholarship donor, she asked for a writing sample from one of their top students, Kalen Michaels. An hour later, a PDF landed in her inbox. It was a paper he'd written for his advanced English class just last semester. The title, Themes of Justice and Mercy in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. Her heart beat a steady, triumphant rhythm. She scrolled through the paper. And there it was, on the 3rd page. The exact same line, "Oh, it is excellent to have a giant's strength." It was a match. A direct, undeniable link from the taunting email, right back to Kalen's own schoolwork. It was his digital fingerprint, more unique and damning than a physical one. The ghost had finally signed his name. She picked up her radio. "All units. We have probable cause. Prepare to move on 1428 Hemlock Street. Suspect is a juvenile, but consider him intelligent and potentially arrogant. No signs of violence, but take no chances." At that very moment, Kalen was in his kitchen, making a sandwich. He was still riding the high of his Shakespearean jab. His aunt was at work. The house was quiet. He heard the first sound, the crunch of tires on gravel, and dismissed it as a neighbor. Then he heard more. Car doors slamming. Not gently. With purpose. His blood ran cold. The smirk melted from his face. He walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain just an inch. The street was full of black and white police cars, their lights silent but spinning, painting the houses in frantic flashes of blue and red. Officers in tactical vests were taking position behind their doors, weapons drawn. The quiet street had become a war zone, and he was the target. A voice, amplified and terrifyingly calm, boomed from a loudspeaker. Kalen Michaels. This is the Cedar Falls Police Department. We have a warrant for your arrest. Exit the house immediately with your hands up. The world seemed to slow down. The sandwich, the laptop, the quote from Shakespeare, it all felt like a dream, a game that had suddenly, violently, become real. This wasn't code on a screen. These were real guns. Real handcuffs. He stood there, frozen for a moment, the giant strength he felt he had now utterly gone. He was just a kid in a kitchen. With a deep, shuddering breath, he walked to the front door and opened it, squinting against the afternoon sun. He slowly raised his hands. 2 officers rushed forward, grabbed him, spun him around, and pushed him against the side of the house. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The bite of it was a shock. A final, physical end to his digital fantasy. As they read him his Miranda rights, Detective Rostova walked up. She didn't look triumphant. She looked professional. Resigned. Kalen, his voice trembling despite his best efforts, found his arrogance one last time. He looked her in the eye and said, "You have nothing. It's all circumstantial. It won't stick." He was still playing the part. Still trying to win the game. But the board had just been flipped over. And he was in handcuffs. The interrogation room was exactly like you see in the movies, but somehow more boring, and because of that, more real. Concrete block walls. A scratched metal table bolted to the floor. A smell of stale coffee and antiseptic cleaner. And Kalen Michaels, sitting in a hard plastic chair, the cuffs still on his wrists, trying to look like he owned the place. Detective Rostova sat across from him, a file folder closed in front of her. She didn't say anything at first. She just let the silence hang there, heavy and uncomfortable. She was letting the reality of the situation sink in. The handcuffs. The locked door. The complete loss of control. Kalen broke first. Of course he did. "You know you have to charge me or release me," he said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "And since you have nothing, I suggest we skip to the release part." Rostova smiled, a small, thin thing that didn't reach her eyes. "We have plenty of time, Kalen. Let's just talk." And so began the chess match. Rostova would lay out a piece of evidence, and Kalen, the prodigy, would knock it down. She mentioned the money transferred to his aunt's pharmacy. He shrugged. "I told you. A freelance gig. Anonymous client. Paid in crypto. You can trace it if you want." He knew they couldn't. She brought up the sophisticated hacking methods. He leaned forward, a glint in his eye. "Detective, the method you're describing would require root-level access and a zero-day exploit. The tools for that aren't exactly on the public library's computers. Your forensic analysis must be flawed." He was using jargon to confuse, to intimidate. He was good. Scarily good. He wasn't just denying. He was deconstructing her entire case, piece by piece, in real time. He was proving his intelligence with every word, and in doing so, he was feeding his own arrogance. He could see the frustration in the eyes of the other officer watching through the two-way mirror. He felt like he was winning. Then, Rostova shifted tactics. She opened the folder. It was a printout of the shipping manifest for the P.O. box. And this high-end networking hardware shipped to a Marcus Fry at P.O. Box 1142, she asked, her voice calm. Kalen didn't even blink. A friend. Online gamer. He needed a secure connection, didn't want it coming to his house. "I was doing him a favor." "A friend," Rostova repeated slowly. "What's his name?" "Like I said, Marcus." "Last name? Phone number? How did you meet him?" Kalen waved his cuffed hands dismissively. Online. Forums. You know how it is. We don't use real names. It's for privacy. It was the perfect, modern-day alibi. A ghost for a ghost. An untraceable online friend. He had built a scapegoat out of thin air, and he was watching Rostova try to punch a hole through smoke. She stared at him for a long, long time. He stared back, unblinking, the picture of cool defiance. Finally, she closed the folder with a soft thump. She stood up and walked to the door. She spoke to the officer on the other side of the glass, her voice low but clear enough for Kalen to hear. We have nothing concrete. It's all circumstantial. The alibi, while flimsy, is plausible. We can't hold him. She turned back to Kalen. You're free to go. For now. The cuffs were taken off. The door was opened. Kalen stood up, rubbing his wrists, a slow, victorious smile spreading across his face. He had done it. He had outsmarted them in their own house. He walked out of the interrogation room, down the hall, and through the buzzing precinct, past the scowling officers. He felt like a champion walking off the field. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of the police station and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. He took a deep, free breath. He had won. What he didn't see was Detective Rostova, watching him from her office window upstairs. She wasn't scowling. She wasn't frustrated. She was analyzing. She had just done something very deliberate. She had let the fish off the hook. Because a fish that feels safe, that thinks it's won, will swim back to its favorite hiding spot. It will get comfortable. It will get careless. She had seen the look in his eyes. Not fear, but thrill. He enjoyed this. He wouldn't be able to stop. And the next time he moved, she wouldn't be chasing a ghost. She'd be following a proud, arrogant young man, right to the scene of his own downfall. He thought the game was over. But for Detective Rostova, the real game had just begun. Walking out of that police station was the single most empowering moment of Kalen's life. He felt like a gladiator who had just stared down the emperor and lived. He spent the next few days riding that high, replaying his cool, calculated answers in his head. He'd beaten them. It was over. But the system is a slow-turning gear. And while Kalen was celebrating, that gear was still grinding forward. Detective Rostova took her entire case file, the digital evidence, the shipping manifest, the library records, the Shakespeare quote, the recording of his arrogant interrogation, and laid it all on the desk of the county district attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Angela Rossi. Rossi listened, her expression unreadable. When Rostova finished, Rossi leaned back in her chair. It's circumstantial, she said, echoing Kalen's own words. A good defense attorney could pick it apart. He's representing himself, Rostova replied, a hint of something in her voice. Not quite a smile. More like grim certainty. D.A. Rossi's eyebrows went up. Then, a slow, cold smile spread across her face. Is he now? She tapped the file folder with one perfectly manicured nail. The kid is smart, but he's not a lawyer. He's read the law, but he's never practiced it. There's a difference. She made her decision. We proceed. Let's see how his textbook knowledge holds up in a real courtroom. And just like that, the full weight of the state was officially brought down upon Kalen Michaels. A week later, he stood in a courtroom for the first time. Not the dingy, dramatic kind from TV, but a bright, fluorescent-lit room with scuffed linoleum floors and the faint smell of lemon-scented cleaner. It was bureaucratic and boring, and that made it even more intimidating. This was the arraignment. A procedural hearing where the charges are read. The charge was read aloud by a court clerk, grand larceny in the first degree, a Class B felony. The words hung in the air. Felony. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was a charge that carried real prison time. And then, Kalen saw the judge. Judge Wright. He was an older man, with a full head of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He had tired eyes that had seen every kind of lie and excuse, and they showed no emotion whatsoever. He read the charges in a flat, monotone voice, as if he were reading a grocery list. When the judge asked for his plea, Kalen stood up. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady, projecting it through the room. Your Honor, I am representing myself pro se. And I plead not guilty. A faint murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Wright's impassive eyes shifted to him. He didn't look impressed. He didn't look annoyed. He just looked. Kalen, feeling the need to perform, continued. The state has no case. They are prosecuting the wrong person while the real criminals, like Silas Vance, profit from the suffering of people like my aunt. This is a miscarriage of justice. It was his Shakespearean email all over again. A grand, moral statement. Judge Wright didn't react. He didn't nod, he didn't frown. He simply made a note on his paperwork and said, in that same bored tone, "The plea is entered. Trial is set for 60 days from today. Mr. Michaels, I strongly advise you to seek counsel." And that was it. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed in the quiet room. As a bailiff let him out, Kalen felt a new kind of thrill. This was the main stage. This was where he would prove his genius to the world. He had the system right where he wanted it. He completely missed the way Judge Wright had watched him. It wasn't with the frustration Kalen had seen in the police. It was with something else, a deep, profound sadness. As if the judge was looking at a car crash he'd seen 100 times before and knew exactly how it was going to end. Kalen was writing his opening argument in his head, already victorious. He had no idea that in the eyes of the law, he was no longer a brilliant rebel. He was just another defendant. And the man on the bench held his future in his hands. So Kalen is representing himself, thinking he's the smartest person in the room. But what would you do in his situation? Trust the system? Or double down on your own genius? Let me know in the comments below. The day of the trial arrived, and Kalen walked into the courtroom not as a scared kid, but as a star stepping onto his stage. He'd refused a public defender, carrying instead a crisp new legal pad and a pen. He was ready. The room was full of murmuring people, the jury a panel of strangers who held his fate in their hands. He made a point of smiling warmly at them. He saw Detective Rostova sitting calmly in the back, her expression unreadable. And up on the bench, Judge Wright, looking as carved from stone as ever. The prosecutor, D.A. Rossi, gave her opening statement. It was sharp, factual, and painted Kalen as a clever, calculating thief who believed he was above the law. It was good. But Kalen wasn't worried. Then it was his turn. He stood up, buttoned his single cheap suit jacket, and walked to the lectern. He didn't need notes. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice clear and confident. "The prosecution is right about one thing. There is a clever criminal in this story. But they've arrested the wrong man." He paused, letting that sink in. They want to talk about digital trails and money transfers. But they don't want to talk about why. They don't want to talk about Silas Vance, a man who preys on the sick and the poor. They don't want to talk about a woman who needed medicine she couldn't afford because a powerful man stole from her. He weaved a story not of facts and figures, but of injustice and desperation. He was the devoted nephew, the brilliant student forced to watch his family suffer. He wasn't denying the crime, he was justifying it. He was making them see his truth. By the time he sat down, he could feel it, he had them. A few jurors were even nodding slightly. The first few witnesses for the prosecution were technical experts. And this is where Kalen truly shone. When a digital forensics analyst took the stand, Kalen approached for cross-examination. The analyst talked about proxy servers and encrypted layers. Kalen listened patiently, then dismantled him. "Mr. Wilkins," Kalen said, his tone polite, almost scholarly. "You testified that the hack used a method called TCP sequence prediction to spoof the origin server, correct?" The analyst, surprised by the technical depth, nodded. "That's one theory. But for that to work," Kalen continued, "the attacker would need to be within the same local area network as the target, correct? A LAN-level attack. Is there any evidence the hacker was ever on Silas Vance's local network?" The analyst shifted in his seat. Well, no, but... So, your theory is fundamentally flawed, Kalen said smoothly, not letting him finish. He turned to the jury with a slight, knowing shrug, as if to say, see? They don't even know what they're talking about. He did this again and again. He used complex jargon, cited obscure technical standards, and created so much reasonable doubt about the how that the who started to feel irrelevant. He wasn't just defending himself, he was putting on a clinic. He was proving his intellectual superiority to everyone in the room. Throughout it all, he would glance at Judge Wright, expecting to see frustration, or at least respect for a worthy opponent. But he saw neither. Judge Wright just watched him, his silver-haired head resting on his hand, his eyes fixed on Kalen. And in those eyes, Kalen saw no anger, no admiration. He saw something that, for a fleeting second, made his confidence waver. He saw a deep, bottomless sadness. It was the look you'd give a man walking cheerfully toward a cliff edge. Kalen shook it off. The old judge was just frustrated that he couldn't control the narrative. He was boring. Kalen was the star. As he sat down after another brilliant technical takedown, he felt invincible. The jury was looking at him with interest, even respect. He was winning. He was sure of it. He had no idea that the entire performance, the jargon, the arrogance, the theatrical righteousness, it was all just building a single, specific profile for the jury. The profile of the exact kind of person who would have done this crime. He wasn't proving his innocence. He was proving his guilt, with every clever word that came out of his mouth. The prosecution's final witness was called Detective Eva Rostova. Kalen watched her take the stand, a flicker of his old smirk returning. What could she possibly say? She had no new technical data. She was just the person he'd already outsmarted in the interrogation room. This would be easy. D.A. Rossi began with the simple facts of the investigation. But then, she asked the question that changed the entire energy of the room. Detective, based on your entire investigation, what can you tell us about the character of the person who committed this crime? Kalen shot up. Objection. Speculation. The detective is not a psychologist. Judge Wright looked down. Overruled. The witness may offer a professional opinion based on her investigative experience. Rostova turned her gaze to the jury, and she began to paint a picture. Not with code, but with human behavior. The person who did this, she said, her voice calm and sure, is highly intelligent. They are not impulsive. They studied. They prepared for months. She glanced at Kalen. They are also deeply arrogant. They believe their intellect places them above the rules that govern everyone else. Kalen felt a hot flush creep up his neck. This wasn't about facts anymore. This was an attack. This was not a crime of desperation, she continued. It was a crime of conviction. The offender has a strong, almost rigid moral compass, but it's one they built themselves. They see themselves as a hero, righting a wrong. This righteousness, it's what fueled them. And it's also what made them so hard to catch. They weren't just hiding, they were performing. She then walked the jury through it all again, but this time, she connected the dots not with data cables, but with human motivation. The library legal research wasn't just preparation, it was the blueprint for his arrogance. The Shakespeare quote wasn't just a taunt, it was a cry for recognition. The way he represented himself wasn't just a choice, it was the final, ultimate act of his superiority complex. Every piece of evidence that Kalen had so cleverly explained away now clicked into a new, terrifying pattern. The portrait she was painting was undeniably, unmistakably, his. When it was Kalen's turn for cross-examination, he stood up, but for the first time, he felt off balance. How do you cross-examine someone who's just told the jury who you are? He tried to trip her up on procedure, on the lack of physical evidence. He ended with his usual flourish. It's a compelling story, detective. But where's your proof? Rostova didn't flinch. She didn't get defensive. She simply turned her head and looked directly at him, her eyes holding a strange mix of pity and certainty. The truth doesn't need a router log to exist, son, she said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. It just is. And in that moment, A hairline fracture appeared in Kalen's armor. The intellectual fortress he'd built so carefully felt suddenly fragile. She hadn't outsmarted his brain. She had spoken to his soul. And for the first time since this began, the boy genius had absolutely nothing to say. With Detective Rostova's final, piercing words hanging in the air, the prosecution did something simple and devastating. Rossi stood and said, "Your Honor, the state rests." It was over. Their case was in. And as Kalen looked at it, laid out on the table, he felt a surge of relief. It was all circumstantial. A story built on psychology and might-have-beens. They had no smoking gun. They had no video of him typing the commands. They had no direct link. He leaned over to his aunt, who sat in the front row, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles were white. "It's okay," he whispered, giving her a confident smile. "They have nothing. I'm not calling any witnesses. I don't need to. They didn't prove their case. The burden is on them, and they failed." He saw the doubt in her eyes, the fear, but he also saw her wanting to believe him. He was her brilliant boy. He had to be right. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would give a powerful closing argument, dismantling the prosecution's story piece by piece, and then sit down. The jury would have no choice but to acquit. He had them right where he wanted them. But then, D.A. Rossi stood up again. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, the state would like to call one brief rebuttal witness." A rebuttal witness? Kalen's mind raced. Who? He'd already torn apart all their technical people. Who was left? The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and in walked Silas Vance. A low murmur rippled through the room. Kalen felt like all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Vance was wearing a suit that was too expensive for the room, and he had a smug, practiced look of respectability on his face. He took the stand and was sworn in. Rossi approached him. "Mr. Vance, the defense's entire argument seems to be that you are a corrupt slumlord who deserved to be stolen from. Can you tell the court what the missing funds were intended for?" Vance cleared his throat, looking right at the jury. "That money was earmarked for long-overdue renovations to my properties on Maple Street. New plumbing. Roof repairs. It was for the tenants' benefit." Kalen stared, disbelief turning to boiling rage. It was a lie. A complete and utter lie. The money was hidden offshore. It was dirty. And this man was standing there, painting himself as a benevolent landlord. He couldn't help himself. The performance, the control, it all vanished in a wave of pure, hot fury. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching backwards. "Objection! He's lying. That money was never for renovations. It was hidden. He's a parasite. A liar." His voice was raw, shouting across the courtroom. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. Judge Wright's gavel cracked down once, twice, 3 times. "Mr. Michaels, sit down and control yourself. You are in contempt." But Kalen was beyond hearing. He was pointing a trembling finger at Vance, his face flushed, all his cool intellect burned away by the fire of seeing true injustice sitting right in front of him, smiling. In that one unhinged moment, he had done exactly what the prosecution wanted. He had shown the jury the real Kalen Michaels. Not the cool, calculating genius, but a furious, emotional boy. And in doing so, he made Silas Vance, the slumlord, look like the calm, reasonable one. The net, which he thought he had escaped, was now closing around him for good. The courtroom was utterly silent. The air was thick with the aftermath of Kalen's outburst. The judge's warning for contempt still hung in the room like a threat. Kalen sat, his hands clenched into fists on the table, his entire body trembling with shame and rage. He had blown it. He knew it. But as he sat there, staring at the grain of the wooden table, something shifted inside him. The anger didn't disappear, but it cooled, hardening into a new kind of resolve. This wasn't about winning a game of wits anymore. This was about survival. This was about truth. When it was time for his closing argument, he stood up slowly. He didn't look at the jury right away. He walked to the lectern, took a deep breath, and then finally raised his eyes to meet theirs. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its former arrogance. "For the last few days, you've heard a lot about what I did, or what they think I did. You've heard about codes and proxies and digital ghosts." He paused, letting the silence work for him. "But you haven't heard the whole story. The prosecution called Silas Vance a victim. They talked about his missing renovation money." Kalen shook his head, a sad, disbelieving smile on his face. "I lost my temper when he said that, and I apologize to this court for that. But I ask you, if you saw a man stand in this very room and lie through his teeth, pretending to be a saint while he poisons a whole community, wouldn't you feel a little angry too?" He wasn't shouting now. He was just talking. And the jury was listening. "They've painted me as arrogant. And maybe I am. Maybe I was so sure I knew right from wrong that I thought I could be the judge and the jury. But I never pretended to be anything I'm not. I'm just a kid who loves his family." He turned and pointed to his aunt, Carla, who had tears streaming silently down her face. "That woman raised me. She worked double shifts at a diner her whole life and never complained. And Silas Vance. He took the one thing she had, her security deposit, money she needed for the medicine that keeps her heart beating, over a cracked tile. A cracked tile. When she asked for it back, he laughed. He laughed at her." Kalen's voice wavered for the first time, thick with genuine emotion. He wasn't performing now. This was real. "So yes," he continued, turning back to the jury, his eyes glistening. "I studied the law. I studied it because I believed in it. I believed it was supposed to protect people like my aunt from people like Silas Vance. But the law wasn't there for her. It protected him. So what was I supposed to do? Watch her suffer? Or take a stand?" He leaned forward on the lectern, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The prosecution says I think I'm above the law. But that's not true. I'm begging you to see that sometimes the law, as it's written, isn't the same thing as justice. I'm not asking you to approve of what I might have done. I'm asking you to understand why. I'm asking you to look at the whole picture, not just the digital one, but the human one." He took a step back, spreading his hands. "They have no proof I did this. What they have is a story about a boy who fits a profile. But you cannot convict a person because he seems like the type. You cannot send someone to prison because he got angry when a liar took the stand. The burden of proof is on them. And they have not met it." He looked at each juror, one by one. "So I will ask you one last time. Look at the facts. Look at the lack of real evidence. And when you do, the only verdict you can possibly reach is not guilty." He didn't say another word. He simply nodded, turned, and walked back to his seat. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. There were no clever quotes, no technical jargon. There was only the raw, emotional echo of a boy who had bared his soul. For a breathtaking moment, as he sat down, he truly believed it had been enough. He had reached them. He saw it in their eyes. He had turned the entire case around with one heartfelt plea. He had given the performance of his life. And he was sure, this time, that the curtain was about to fall on his victory. The silence after Kalen's closing argument was the most powerful sound he had ever heard. He could feel the jury's eyes on him, their expressions a mix of thoughtfulness and sympathy. He had done it. He had truly reached them. The trial was over. All that was left was for the judge to give the jury their final instructions, and then it would be in their hands. He allowed himself a small, shaky breath of relief. It was almost done. But then, Judge Wright did not pick up his gavel. He did not call for the jury. Instead, he leaned forward, his aged hands clasped on the bench. He looked not at the jury, but directly at Kalen. His stone-carved face was unreadable, but his eyes held a terrifying intensity. "Mr. Michaels," the judge said, his voice low and clear, cutting through the quiet room. "Before I dismiss the jury to begin their deliberations, there is one piece of evidence I would like to enter into the record. With the court's permission." A confused murmur broke out in the gallery. D.A. Rossi looked as startled as anyone. What evidence? The prosecution had rested. The defense had rested. The trial was over. Kalen's heart, which had just begun to slow down, launched into a frantic rhythm again. This wasn't normal. This wasn't procedure. He stood up, his legal mind, his love for the rules, screaming in protest. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice tighter than he wanted. "What evidence? This is highly improper. The trial is concluded." Judge Wright's gaze didn't waver. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment the entire time. "It pertains to the defendant's character, Mr. Michaels," the judge replied, his words measured and deliberate. "To his state of mind. And to a pattern of behavior that I believe this court must see before it can render a true verdict." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the room. Kalen stood frozen, his mind racing. A pattern? What pattern? "I think it is paramount," Judge Wright continued, that single word dripping with significance, "that the jury understands the full context of the choices that were made. Not just the choices of the last few months, but the choices that led us here today." Kalen could only stare, his confidence shattering into a million pieces. This wasn't in any of his law books. This wasn't a move he had anticipated. The judge, the one person who was supposed to be a neutral referee, was suddenly changing the game in its final second. And Kalen had no idea what the new rules were. The courtroom was frozen. No one breathed. All eyes were fixed on Judge Wright, who slowly, deliberately, removed his reading glasses. He wasn't looking at a file. He wasn't reading a piece of evidence. He was looking inward, into a past that was suddenly about to crash into the present. 20 years ago, he began, his voice losing its judicial monotone and becoming something softer, older, and filled with pain, a young man stood in a courtroom not unlike this one. He was brilliant, arrogant, and he was convinced the world was a game he was smart enough to win. Kalen stood by his table, his body rigid, his mind screaming that this was some kind of trick. But he couldn't move. He was trapped. This young man, Judge Wright continued, was a hacker. He saw a system he believed was corrupt, that protected the powerful. And he decided to take matters into his own hands. He targeted a businessman he saw as a parasite. He executed a digital heist, flawlessly. He stole a large sum of money, believing he was a hero, a modern-day Robin Hood. A cold dread, colder than any he had ever felt, began to creep up Kalen's spine. The details, they were too familiar. "He was caught," the judge said, a sigh escaping his lips. "Not because he was careless with his code, but because of his arrogance. He felt so sure of his own intellect that he, too, chose to represent himself. He stood right where you are standing now, Mr. Michaels, and he gave a brilliant, passionate closing argument about justice and a broken system." Judge Wright's eyes finally locked with Kalen's. And in them, Kalen saw it, not a judge, but a man. A man broken by his own history. "The jury didn't see a hero," the judge said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They saw a criminal who thought he was above the law. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Kalen felt the floor sway beneath him. "While he was in prison," Judge Wright continued, the words now coming like blows, "his wife left him. She took their infant son with her. She moved away, changed their names, and he never saw the boy again. He lost everything. His freedom. His family. His future." The judge paused, gathering himself, the weight of the decades pressing down on him. When he was released, he was a different man. He had been humbled by the system he thought he could outsmart. So, he dedicated his life to understanding it. He went to law school. He became a prosecutor. And eventually, he put on the robes of a judge, hoping he could maybe, in some small way, guide others away from the cliff he himself had jumped off. He stood up from his bench. It was a slow, painful movement. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the wooden surface, his gaze pinning Kalen to the spot. "That man was me," he said, the confession echoing in the stunned silence. And the son I never knew. The son whose mother wanted to protect him from his father's legacy. The son she named Kalen Michaels. Is you. The truth didn't just dawn on Kalen. It exploded inside him, shattering every reality he had ever known. The world tilted on its axis. The brilliant plan, the moral crusade, the feeling of unique genius. It all crumbled to dust in an instant. He hadn't been a hero. He hadn't been a revolutionary. He had been an echo. A carbon copy. A boy following a script his father had written 20 years before, step by tragic step. The obsession with the law, the arrogance, the target, the method, the self-representation. It wasn't a profile he fit. It was a legacy he had inherited. He looked at the face of the judge, this stern, silver-haired man, and for the first time, he saw the ghost of his own features. He saw the same intensity in the eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. He wasn't a ghost in the machine. He was just his father's son. And he had walked directly into the same trap, repeating history with a heartbreaking, terrifying precision. The game was over, and he had lost before he had even pressed his first key. For a long moment, there was no sound in the courtroom. It was as if the revelation had sucked all the oxygen, all the noise, right out of the world. Kalen didn't hear the gasps from the gallery. He didn't see the shocked faces of the jury. All he could see was the man standing above him. The judge. His father. The arrogant, brilliant fortress he had built around himself didn't just crack, it vaporized. The confidence that had fueled him, the belief that he was unique, a singular genius fighting a corrupt world. It was all a lie. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even an original sinner. He was a sequel. A cheap, pathetic copy of a story that had already been told, and had already ended in tragedy. He felt the blood drain from his face. His legs gave way, and he stumbled back into his chair, the hard plastic jarring him. He couldn't breathe. The weight of it was physical, crushing his chest. All the clever arguments, the legal precedents, the technical jargon, it all turned to ash in his mouth. What did any of it matter now? He had spent months studying the law, trying to outsmart a system his own father had already been broken by. He had looked at this man, day after day, and seen only an obstacle, an authority figure to be defeated. He never saw the ghost staring back at him. Judge Wright, his father, slowly sat back down. The formal power of the bench was gone from his posture. He just looked like a tired, heartbroken old man. "I failed you," the judge said, his voice thick with an emotion Kalen had never heard from him before, raw, unvarnished regret. "I failed you by being absent. I wasn't there to teach you, to guide you, to warn you about the arrogance that ran in our blood." He looked at his son, and a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. The courtroom was so silent you could hear it. "And I see now," the judge continued, "that I failed you again by being an example you were doomed to follow. You didn't just study the law, son. You inherited the flaw that broke me, the belief that you are above it, that your brain, your sense of what's right, makes the rules irrelevant." Kalen could only stare, his own eyes burning. The anger was gone. The defiance was gone. All that was left was a hollow, howling emptiness. He saw his entire life reframed in an instant. His obsession, his isolation, his drive, it wasn't his own. It was a ghost haunting him from a past he never knew. Judge Wright took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound amplified in the silent room. He straightened his shoulders, the judge once more, but the pain in his eyes remained. "Therefore, in the interest of justice, and because I can no longer be an impartial arbiter in a matter that so directly involves my own failure, I hereby recuse myself from this case. A mistrial is declared." The gavel came down. Crack. It wasn't a sound of victory or defeat. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on one life, and opening onto another, a darker, more complicated one. As bailiffs moved toward a dazed Kalen, Judge Wright spoke one last time, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the room. "The truth isn't a tool to win a game, Kalen. It's the burden we carry." He looked at his son, his expression a devastating mix of love, pity, and shared failure. "And now," he said, You must carry yours. Kalen was led away. He didn't look back at the jury, or at his weeping aunt. He didn't look at the prosecutor. The legal system, once a game to be won, now became a slow, grinding machine. With a mistrial declared, the case against Kalen wasn't dropped. It was reset. But the fight had gone out of him. The fire of his genius had been doused by a truth colder than any prison cell. He sat in a meeting with a new, court-appointed lawyer, a weary public defender who saw just another kid in over his head. The man laid out the options. They could go to trial again, with a new judge. They could fight. Kalen shook his head. No, he said, his voice flat. I'll plead guilty. It wasn't a surrender. It was an acceptance. He was finally admitting, not just to the crime, but to the deeper truth his father had revealed. He was guilty of the same arrogance, the same fatal flaw. Fighting it any longer would just be repeating the pattern, proving his father right all over again. The plea bargain was swift. Because of his age, his clean record, and the unusual circumstances, he was sentenced to 2 years in a juvenile detention facility, with a long period of probation to follow. It was a fraction of the time his father had served. A mercy he knew he probably didn't deserve. Prison was nothing like he'd imagined. It wasn't a dramatic test of wills. It was boring. It was monotonous. It was a life of gray routines and echoing sounds. The other inmates didn't care that he was a brilliant hacker. They just saw a quiet, skinny kid who kept to himself. Then, a month into his sentence, a letter arrived. It was on simple, plain paper, no return address. But the handwriting was unmistakably the same as the one he'd seen on court documents for weeks. Strong, precise, judicial. He opened it with trembling hands. There was no "Dear son." No "Love, Dad." There were no excuses. No pleas for forgiveness. It was just a single sentence, written in the center of the otherwise blank page. The best moves aren't about winning the game, but about preserving your humanity for the one after. Kalen read it once. Then again. And again. He sat on the edge of his bunk, the paper held tight in his hands, and for the first time, he didn't feel anger or bitterness toward the man who had written it. He felt a connection. A shared, painful lesson. His father wasn't trying to condemn him or save him. He was passing on a piece of the wreckage from his own crash. A warning flare from the other side. In the quiet of his cell, Kalen finally understood. His sentence wasn't the 2 years behind bars. His real sentence was this knowledge. This burden of truth. The lifelong understanding of the devastating pattern he had almost completed. He started reading again. But this time, it wasn't law books or code manuals. It was history. Philosophy. He wasn't studying how to beat the system anymore. He was trying, for the first time, to understand the fragile, complicated humanity it was built to serve. The game was over. And for the first time in his life, Kalen Michaels was finally, truly, learning. Time passed. Kalen served his sentence and was released into a world that felt both the same and entirely different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful understanding. He was just a young man now, trying to find his way, the weight of his father's truth a permanent part of him. He'd lie in bed at night, in his old room at his aunt's house, and the question would return, the one without an answer. When his father stood in that courtroom and shattered both their worlds, was he trying to condemn him? Or in his own broken way, was he trying to save him? To stop the cycle before it consumed another generation? Kalen never replied to the letter. He didn't seek his father out. Some echoes, he realized, aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be listened to. They're meant to change the way you walk through the hallways of your own life. He still thought about the law, but not as a game. He saw it now as his father did, not as a system to beat, but as a structure flawed and human that he needed to find his own place within. Not as a master or a conqueror, but perhaps one day as a participant. The brilliant, unyielding boy was gone. In his place was a man who had been humbled by a truth more powerful than any sentence a judge could ever give. He had set out to prove he was smarter than everyone else. And in the end, The most important lesson he learned was about the cost of that very belief. The game was finally over. And for the first time, he was at peace with the silence it left behind. This story makes you wonder about the secrets that shape us, and the truths that can shatter our entire world in an instant. If it left you thinking about justice, legacy, and the price of arrogance, then you need to subscribe. Because next week's story is about a woman who found a door in her basement that wasn't on the blueprints, and it was already open.